So right now, some of the buzzwords that are running around are active management and shared stewardship. So those who are in the Forest Service and fire management, I'm sure you've heard these talked about. Active management, it's been talked about a lot of in a lot of venues. Most recently, in December, right before government shutdown went into place, there was a executive order issued by the president, and it specifically spoke to active management on all government lands, but it specifically called out U.S. Forest Service lands, and it had a focus on reducing wildfire risk and timber harvest. Those were kind of the two key components of the executive order. And so this conversation about active management has continued on, and as it relates to fire, it really revolves around how are we preparing our landscapes to receive fire. And related to that, I think most folks in the Forest Service have heard Chief Christensen talk about shared stewardship and this idea of how do we deliver our programs within the Forest Service. And through this shared stewardship idea, again, how it relates to fire management is this underlying component about we can't make our decisions about what we do on Forest Service land in a bubble, and that we have to have our communities and our partners there engaged with us when we have these brainstorming sessions like this, and we're talking about what we might do in a wilderness area or wherever, and that we got to recognize, especially fire, doesn't recognize our boundaries. Fire's going to do what fire's going to do, and it doesn't care whose jurisdiction it is. And so we have to have these discussions with our partners, and that's kind of the key component of the shared stewardship environment. But I'll tell you right now, in the 4 months I was back there, what was carrying the conversation back in D.C. is, I think we started off the day talking about human compassion. And here recently we have seen some of our neighbors, fellow citizens impacted by fire in terrible, terrible, tragic ways. And the Camp Fire is the most recent example. But what's dominating the conversation back east right now is the impacts of last fire season, and families coming in, mayors, councilmen coming into D.C. telling their stories of how they were impacted by a wildfire, and that's dominating the conversation right now. And so anything we talk about in terms of seeking to meet our forest plan objectives can't lose sight of how the human element factors into the conversation. Another thing that's getting a lot of talk about back in D.C. is fire risk and transmission. And Montana's no different. We've seen a lot of, particularly amongst state foresters, concern with whether the decisions we're making on National Forest System lands have a negative impact, particularly to the state treasury, for fires that might come off of National Forest System land and impact lands that are under somebody else's jurisdiction, particularly the state or private. These questions have been swirling about. Not a whole lot of it has a lot of science behind it until here recently. And now we've seen some science starting to come around. Alan Ayer, in particular, has been very central to looking into this question about, who's really the net senders and receivers of fire back and forth across jurisdictions. And so there's been some research now that we can kind of pick up and look at and have these conversations with our partners. Again, jump back to this shared stewardship idea. When we sit down at the table with our partners, have something to talk about, and some of this data is coming around about this transmission problem, particularly when it comes to wilderness fires. This has been one of the core issues, and since 1988, Canyon Creek, and we've seen it play over and over again. Just this last year, 2018, Polk Creek Fire, you went to Wasatch Cache down in Utah. Very similar kind of situation. High elevation fire, sat there. It's in a location that typically doesn't get up and go. It got up and went. Last year, no injuries, no structures lost, but 6,000 folks had to evacuate residents for a while, and it was an election year. And so politicians make hay on those kinds of years. And so, that idea of us making a decision in a vacuum is something that's being talked about a lot now, and having this discussion about, where are our partners with us, and then we had this conversation in advance. Just a couple other ideas here. So I was cool. I got to catch up with Jim and Coulter. We've been talking about Forest Service manual and getting wilderness policy lined up with the fuels management policy. So we're still working on that, and progress is being made. But something else that while I was back east and kind of bouncing back and forth between Idaho, there's more conversations now about wilderness as its value in recreation, and with burgeoning populations back west. Boise, if anybody's been back there lately, it's blowing out. Missoula, blowing out. All these places are becoming kind of recreation hubs. Anywhere there's some place for outdoor recreation, it's starting to come under pressure, and we're starting to see conversations spool up. I don't know if you're having those around here, but back in Idaho, there's lots of talk about, hey, we ought to let some pedal bike stuff go on in wilderness. That would be cool, wouldn't it? Those conversations could have a big, that could change things quite a bit. Those would be some different dynamics we'd have to consider. Anyway, I was just thinking through a bunch of different fire scenarios across the country. So I know we're kind of focused on the Bob Marshall here. My personal experience, I've dabbled in the Bob. Most of my experience, practical experience, has been on the Gila, Frank Church, and Flat Tops. And so, a lot of different, I really appreciate what the presenters have been showing us this morning, because it really resonates with my personal observations. On the Gila, where you got that ponderosa that's been worked on, and folks down there would argue, well, we got started the same year that the Northern Rockies did. We're there 72 too. There's chunks of the Gila now that some folks are claiming might be fireproof, because they have seen enough fire now that, and they've seen it here recently under extreme conditions, and it's behaving in a manner that they think is kind of keeping that ponderosa pine condition fairly stable in some places. Other places, maybe not so much. But then Seagull National Forest here recently, not well known for being a big wilderness fireplace. 2 years ago, district ranger there was getting nervous and said, we've been putting out fires in this area for so long that I'm afraid my legacy is going to be, I'm setting this place up for a total change from a ponderosa pine forest to something else. And that bothered him. And Dennis said, and he'd been talking to folks for a few years in the community saying, I don't think this is acceptable. What do you think? And over the course of several years, kind of got backing to when the conditions were right. They had some lightning out in this chunk of wilderness, and 40,000 acres later, they had a fire footprint out there that was about 11% high severity, and the rest was just about what they wanted. And it was a pretty large impact to that community for a little while, but the end result was they delivered what they said about to do. And so that credibility within the community was also huge, saying, look, here's what we want to do. They accomplished it. The end result was about what they advertised. So, those kinds of efforts are, one at a time, and to build on that, Dennis has since retired, but, the staff that's there on Magdalena District now has got something to work off of. I usually throw this graph up. We have continued to monitor, we call it fire use in our database. And so you fuels folks who are familiar with this know that this has changed over the years. So in the 1990s up to the 2000s, when we had the policy in place, it said if it was a PNF or WFU kind of fire, then all acres that burned within that footprint are good. We're gonna count those towards our accomplishment for the year. In 2009, we modified that to kind of say we're going to do more of an evaluation on the effects, because we kind of stretched our brains a little bit from wilderness only to multiple use forest. And so for multiple use, it's not all about whether a natural process took place or not. We're going to take a little bit more look at the forest plan and say, well, what was it timber we're managing for? Was it water? Is it community safety, movie, recreation, whatever it was? And did the fire effects get us where we wanted to go? And so you can kind of see, even though we changed the pattern, the trajectory stayed the same. We're still on an uptick. We're seeing more acres being reported annually on National Forest System lands as meeting our land management objectives every year. Our peak was 2 years ago. Even last year, PL5, super busy year, we still had over 600 acres reported as meeting our forest plan objectives. So, just kind of throw that one out there to say we're still on a good glide path. We're still showing positive trends throughout the program nationwide. Every time I come to Region 1 or talk to folks from Region 1, this one comes up. Why can't I count my wildfire acres towards my accomplishments? So for the folks who are not Forest Service, and we give out goals to the regions every year from the Washington office and say we would like you to accomplish this many acres of hazardous fuels work. If you can, please, thank you. Always say please and thank you. And then the regions in turn turn to the forest and say, hey, here's the target we got from the national office. We would like you, forest, to accomplish this level of outputs. Please and thank you. I'm sure they say that, right? And so, the program we had in place when things first got kind of going with prescribed fire, prescribed natural fire, those two things were kind of linked, and it all made sense to us at the time that we should talk about these together. There are changes on the landscape that are we believe are positive, and we should report them together as fuels accomplishments. It totally makes sense to us. Apparently, that didn't make sense to the appropriators of Congress, who said, we're giving you hazardous fuels money specifically to mitigate wildland fire risk, and we want to know how you're spending it. And we were having a hard time sorting out our answer from this combination of wildfires and the money that we're given forests and regions specifically to take on mechanical thinning projects and accomplish prescribed fire. So, a couple of years ago, we changed the reporting rules. And this allows us to a better attempt at transparency, so we can explain to Congress how we're spending their money that's specific to hazardous fuels. Even though we know what's important to us as land managers is we want to know what the net effect on the landscape is. So we still want to keep track of, what's our net effect overall, and so we still want to keep tabs on fire footprints that are meeting our land management objectives. But we did change the rules so that for the target that we're asking a forest to accomplish is only that they're getting funded for to do mechanical thinning and prescribed fire. There's downsides and upsides to that. So I would say there's a very legitimate downside to this process. Where's the incentives for our decision makers to say, I'm going to get recognized for making a land management decision based on that. Was it Carol had the land stewardship? That sense of stewardship that kind of drives our best decision makers to make very difficult decisions. This system doesn't help set up that incentive quite so well. But on the other side, it has been super effective at this conversation that we're having with Congress about continued investment in our fire risk reduction. So there's, these pros and cons of making these changes. So I don't know if anybody's been paying attention, but in federal government, nothing has gone up in the budget anywhere except hazardous fuels. And we have seen a steady support with Congress, and part of that has to do with some of this transparency that we're providing them, saying here's what your investment is buying you. So it's a difficult it's a difficult path to try to navigate. Any ideas that folks have, this is like everything. These are always solutions that make sense at the time, and are open to be discussed. And so here's probably one of those good places to deviate from. And so I'll just start going to questions, and Will, go for it.
Well, just a comment more than a question, but I understand and I do appreciate the success that that strategy has had for congressional appropriations and HF funding. My fear, given the demographics of the agency right now, is we are setting up a system, particularly as we see turnover in line officers, and we've all talked about the lack of institutional knowledge, the lack of institutional experience. I just want to, I think we need to give some serious thought to not setting up a system where people are incentivized to not make the right decision, as you pointed out.
No, I think that's a great point, and so demographics of the the line officer corps, of course, and then I guess something else is we're seeing, at least in the last couple of years, I don't know how many meetings folks have been to where the majority of folks there are actings in their position as opposed to, this is the position I hold. So we are also seeing the stress in our organization about folks. We're just not keeping pace with just natural attrition throughout our workforce. So that adds another layer of difficulty to folks who are already making difficult decisions. So, Erin?
I was going to ask you, and I don't know if you've thought about this or not, but what could we give to Congress to justify us using fire in a wilderness? Like, have you thought about like a product that we could deliver to them to say, this is why we're doing this? And I guess what I'm thinking is there something we could do on individual fires and then we report up to be able to say, hey, this is how, and we use existing research to somehow transcend the story, but this is how we've safeguarded these communities because of this investment. Like what can we give them in order to get the buy-in like they're getting for hazardous fuels right now? Because they used to not care about hazardous fuels, and now they do. So what can we do for wilderness fire to do that?
So that's awesome question, Erin. So just a couple of ideas, and I'm sure other folks in the room probably have others. So I'll just throw out a couple of things. One thing we're pretty solid on is there's a general understanding that wilderness, the default response should be, why should we put this fire out? And that's pretty well understood in most of our conversations across the board. So there's a pretty fundamental understanding that I think should be established that the right fire, the right spot, right time, right resources, that we should be looking at any ignition within the wilderness from a perspective of what would compel us to put this fire out. And then as you work through the process, you may come up with some compelling reasons why you would. I think we're pretty good there. We have to continue that conversation, but we're at a pretty good spot right now. Unfortunately, we're probably not at the place you were trying to point to about what's the incentive to drive a program towards greater accomplishment. We don't quite have that, other than we still count wildfire acres as part of our national accomplishment. So we don't put an individual forest or region on the hook to say, you got to produce this much this year. We've been told that that's not a good incentive for wise decision making. And we believe people. And we say, okay, well, we won't do that. We are still holding about an expectation that we're going to have probably 600,000 acres of wildfire accomplishment a year. And we hold that at the Washington office, saying somebody somewhere in the Forest Service is probably going to achieve that, given their conditions. So we don't want to have a perverse incentive out there that drives people to make decisions under pressure. But we still want to have a mechanism to report up and say, hey, look how good we did, or we met our goal. And so that's still part of our conversation. We still expect this year to say, here's how good we did on managing wildfires that are meeting our natural resource objectives. So that's still our hope.